Okay, so the deluge of PlayStation 5 Pro software updates continues unabated. We're not going to be covering all of them, but ones that catch our attention, we're certainly going to be looking at maybe in DF Direct, maybe for standalone videos. But Oliver, this week you've looked at Warhammer 40,000 Darktide on PlayStation 5 Pro. Now, I was really interested to see your results here because on PC this is like you know a mega demanding game, stripped back quite significantly for the console. So, what have we got on the Pro?
Well, so as a bit of background, I covered this game last year on the Xbox. Now it's on the PS5 and PS5 Pro. So the big thing first off out of the gate is you don't get any ray tracing features on PS5 or PS5 Pro. That's critical. So you don't get the Pro-based RTGI, you don't get the reflections, you don't get anything like that on the PlayStation 5, unfortunately. But critically, one thing that has been addressed is the anti-aliasing issue that I noted last year with the Xbox versions, where the aliasing treatment wasn't really there when the game was at rest. That has been resolved here, and the anti-aliasing is functional now. On PS5, it looks like it's about 936p internal, roughly speaking. That's what I got out of a few shots. And it looks like it's taking that to roughly 1440p with some kind of TAAU or possibly FSR2 there. I didn't test it against the PC version, but it did seem to have some upsampling component to me there. And that version, it looks pretty decent now in that performance mode on PS5 because the anti-aliasing is actually resolving correctly, and it's giving you a smooth image at rest and in motion, which wasn't the case last year on the Xboxes. On PS5 Pro, it's running at 1270p internally, according to the developers, and that also aligns closely with my own pixel counts, and it's going to 4K, it looks like, with PSSR. Now, if we do some side-by-sides with that PS5 version in performance mode, though, there's clearly some funny stuff going on in stills. Forgive me if you've heard this before. This is typical PSSR stuff to some degree, but the PSSR image, it looks higher resolution in some sense, like it is resolving into a 4K grid there. It is resolving 1-to-1 into a 4K grid there, and it is giving you more detail on some fine lines, but it's not really sharper on the whole, I would say, even though it is going to higher resolution. It's actually a bit softer often, and that's in part because of this omnipresent shimmer and noise pattern that you see in the PSSR resolve. That's something we see in a lot of games. It actually tends to be at its worst in very dark content, and lo and behold, Warhammer 40k Darktide is full of dark levels and dark areas. Not too much light there. It's the name, exactly. PSSR is never quite cohering into that stable, good-looking anti-aliased image that we want to see out of an upscaler at rest there. There are some things it does better, for sure, like the text here looks quite a bit better. But overall, in stills, I'd kind of prefer the image rendition that we see on the base console there, with whatever their upsampling solution may be there. Obviously not PSSR on the base PS5. In motion, I'd say it leans more towards PSSR, though, with the PS5 Pro, because it perhaps has similar aliasing, but it is sharper than their old upscaling solution. That's something you see pretty often with PSSR. Yeah. Where it does tend to resolve more sharply in motion, whether that comes down to treating history a bit differently, maybe not reusing as much data there or whatever. It tends to be quite a bit sharper in motion. But the aliasing presentation is not amazing. They struggle with different kinds of content, like the old anti-aliasing solution really struggles with the holographic display here, for instance, whereas PSSR can't quite get the floor greebles to look right here. It looks kind of shimmery and ugly there. If we flip over to quality mode here, really quickly, PSSR looks quite a bit worse. The quality mode is going from roughly 1440p internal to 4K there, and it looks a lot sharper and cleaner, especially in still shots. It's not too close at all there. It just looks like a pretty stable and sharp and good-looking 4K image. PSSR is not really giving you that in this title, I would say. Performance-wise, it's not too amazing, but it's not too bad either. It's basically a slightly wobbly 60 FPS. The worst I saw was about 40 FPS there. It's usually running at 60 FPS or a little bit short of it in more busy scenes and more heavy melees in particular. That's when I saw the frame rate start to tumble down into like the 50 FPS region at times. It's basically similar enough to Xbox last year, maybe a little bit worse. I tested PS5 in performance mode, and I did see some frame rate drops there. They didn't seem quite as impactful though. But it's tough because this is an online game and there are so many factors outside of player control, and I didn't have hours and hours to test exhaustively, so all I'll say is that there are some frame rate drops here. So overall, it's not the worst PS5 Pro patch I've seen. I'm glad they've cleaned up their TAA in particular on that base console machine. It looks a lot better than the Xbox versions did at the point that I tested them last year. But PS5 Pro isn't necessarily the kind of upgrade that we'd want to see over PS5 here. I'm not necessarily sure which platform I would prefer in terms of that 60 FPS visual experience, the PS5 Pro in its sole visual mode, or the PS5 in its performance mode. Ultimately, I do suspect quite strongly that it would have been a better option if they'd gone with their old AA solution, their old upsampling solution, deployed the additional GPU power of the PS5 Pro towards a higher internal resolution and possibly maybe a higher output resolution, who knows? Because the fact that we're getting pretty comparable results with an image that is pushing a lot more pixels on the PS5 Pro does suggest to me that perhaps that old solution worked a little bit better for this game and its content there. So yeah, not super happy with it, but it's not a really bad patch necessarily, but it's also not the kind of upgrade that I think people are probably expecting for a title like this.
Tom, where do you stand on the whole PlayStation 5 Pro thing at the moment? Because I'll tell you where I am. I think that there's been some reaction to some of the more poorly implemented or poor results we're seeing from PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution, PSSR. And, there's basically been calls to have an option on the dashboard of the Pro that basically says, don't use the Pro code, use the base PS5 code and allow Game Boost to take over. I think my take on this is that you can't really do that. I think it would be a short-term solution, and it's not a good look for Sony. But I do think that there is certainly a good argument for maybe having options within game to turn on or off PSSR. Where do you sit on it?
I think that's the only way forward, really, for in the short term at least, as they, sort of file off the rough edges on the whole PSSR situation, which is clearly, a situation for that is a bit awkward, to be honest, because the first wave of games that have come out for PS5 Pro, we've had a couple of articles and videos in a row where it's been like PSSR is in the headline. And we don't really want it to be, but it's impossible to ignore that as a downside in some cases, notably third-party titles and notably Unreal Engine 5 games with Lumen, for example, seem to be suffering as well. Call of Duty, as we've mentioned. So it's kind of I think for a £700 console, imagine the disappointment, when you get this thing in and you're pretty much forced. And in a lot of cases, I imagine people will be selling their base PS5 to fund that move. And then there's no way back and they're stuck with, a less appealing image. Yeah, having that option to go back within the game code, to just see how it would be played on the base PS5 using that rendering setup would be a huge benefit. I wish we had that in Silent Hill 2. Remake. We tried the disc-based version, didn't we, with that to access that original PS5 code, but then that's another £100 cost you've got to find to get the disc drive. So,
yeah, that's a bit extreme. I think, ultimately the developers need to curate a good experience for PlayStation 5 Pro, but it's just been interesting to me to see that Sony developers have actually included toggles for PSSR on off. Sure. Which kind of is indicative, I think. And I think it's a practice that can go elsewhere as well. Why not have third-party developers do it? It's clearly not a cure-all, I think, is the bottom line there. Well, obviously there is discussions about how the PSSR situation can be improved, Oliver. There's people are calling for the like the DLL swap out on PC where, you could actually add in a better version of DLSS by swapping the DLL. You can't do that on consoles, but, there have been suggestions that Sony might actually swap in more improved versions of PSSR at the system level. My take on that is I don't know. I think there needs to be a way for developers to more easily integrate those better versions of PSSR, but to actually take that out of the developers' hands could have unwanted side effects for certain games. I mean, what is the way forward on this? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of PSSR games that are just great. You know, it's some really good implementations out there. But then, you know, we're seeing, I'd say this is kind of a more average implementation. It's not great, but, you know, it is what it is. And then there's the outright shockers like Jedi Survivor and the original version of Silent Hill. What do you think is the way that this is to be addressed? Should Sony step in?
Oh boy, that's a big question.
It's a big question.
It's a big question. I think one thing that does work for me personally is offering the old modes as a safety valve. Sort of. Right. I mean, safety valve, maybe that's being pushing it a little bit too far, but you see this a little bit in The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2, where you get the old modes and you get to run them with the greater GPU resources, and you get to enjoy them at higher frame rates with VRR unlocking them. And in that case, they kind of balance the fact that they're giving you these old modes with the fact that they want you to use the new Pro mode, which is generally a good mode and a superior option in most instances, I would say, relative to those old modes. They balance that reality by basically prompting you every time you boot the game without the Pro mode enabled, saying, hey, we prepared this special mode for you, wouldn't you like to try it? And I think that's a good way to go about it, in my opinion. I think the route of providing players a lot of different modes with a lot of different configurations of PSSR, a lot of different ways to play, that is maybe not my preferred way to go. I kind of like the route with the old modes, because at least then you're giving players a kind of base from which to work from, and you are at least saying, you know, if we do happen to mess up these new modes, we're giving you an option to play with the old modes. And those are kind of known good quantities for a lot of titles, right? For older titles, those are known good quantities there. But ultimately, I mean, my preferred solution here would be that games are just set up quite well for PSSR, and that we leave everything up to developer discretion. That'd be kind of my preferred model. But at the moment, I'm not quite sure why. You know, I do think a lot of these issues are probably being caught by QA. It's fairly trivial to pull up the two consoles, the two dev kits on two different monitors and compare them. So I have to imagine a lot of these problems are being caught. I kind of wonder if maybe there's some political element to this, where it's like, well, we want to integrate the new feature from Sony on our new PlayStation 5 Pro version, and that will be a good way to get eyeballs on our game, and that will be a good way to achieve our goals with this title, even if it doesn't necessarily achieve the best visual result. Again, I'm only speculating here because it is unusual that we've seen so many games come through with lackluster, or even in a couple of rare cases, worse than PS5 PSSR implementations. That's certainly quite concerning. I don't really have a good solution for it. Maybe a system level toggle, maybe that would do some good, but I mean, ultimately, my preference is always with consoles to leave it up to developer discretion pretty much, and hope that they would exercise that discretion in a way that is favorable to the ultimate end experience, because I trust them to ship the game in a form that's going to flatter it. And that hasn't been the case so far, but I have to imagine, as knowledge kind of permeates through the industry about this technology and its potential pitfalls, and also its, you know, potential room for improvement in future PSSR iterations, that developers will be implementing PSSR in their titles in a way that more fully supports their artistic vision in terms of achieving really good image quality at high frame rates and all these things that we'd like to see at a PS5 Pro. I kind of hope and kind of think that they'll get there eventually.
Yeah, I think that from my perspective, one of the issues is maybe that games are getting more complex. Launch issues seem to be getting worse. And that was even before the arrival of PlayStation 5 Pro, which means now developers have another SKU they need to address. And maybe something's got to give there. So maybe that is part of the reason why some of these games are launching in a suboptimal state on the PlayStation 5 Pro. Not sure how that would explain games like Jedi Survivor, where, you know, it's basically been out for a very long time and is basically a grafted on add-on as such. But I think the pressures on developers more generally have never been greater, and that's possibly one of the reasons why this is happening. And I think another reason, of course, is the fact that there isn't been a great there isn't as much of a differentiating factor for this Pro console than there is for the last one. The last one was basically, we're going to take your existing games and make them look good on a 4K display. This one is, okay, we're going to make performance mode look better, which is admirable, but you've actually got to deliver on that, and that's not happening on some games. For every Rebirth, there seems to be a Darktide, basically.
Yeah.
That's the way it is. And then sometimes we have the Jedi Survivors, which isn't great. But, I guess right now it is what it is, and it will get better. I just think maybe, there's some people out there who've bought the $700 console and are now wondering why. If you've got to have that uniform increase in quality across all software, just as you would with, let's say I've got a 4060 and I'm going to buy a 4070, my games will run faster. I'll be able to use more features.
Yeah.
That's kind of what should be happening with the Pro.